There is a particular quality of silence that exists only in libraries just before dawn. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting, a held breath. The whisper of dust motes adrift in a beam of pale, uncertain light, settling on leather spines and gilded lettering like snow upon the lids of unopened tombs. Imagine that light falling upon a single, empty space on a shelf, not a gap where a book has been removed and will be returned, but a void, a negative space, a vacancy that has been measured, catalogued, and mourned for centuries. On the librarian's charts, it might bear a name, a title, an author, but the object itself is a ghost. It is a story that exists in the world as a rumor, a receipt, a mention in a forgotten diary, but not as a thing of paper and thread you can hold in your hand. This is the silence that surrounds Cardenio, a play, they say, by William Shakespeare, not a draft, not a collaborative sketch, but a finished work, performed before the king himself. A story of jealous rage, of a lover driven to madness in the wilderness of the Sierra Morena, of a woman who carves her name into trees and waits for a faithless heart to return. It was real. We have the records, the payment slips, the diary entries of those who saw its flames flicker on a London stage. And then, like a candle snuffed by an unseen hand, it vanished. The pages turned to smoke, the words dissolved from memory, leaving only that hollow space on the shelf. For 300 years, that void has beckoned. It has called to scholars with the promise of immortality, to forgers with the whisper of gold, and to dreamers with the fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, a single leaf of it survived, tucked inside another binding, lining an old trunk, waiting to be found. The search for Cardenio is not merely a hunt for a lost book. It is a descent into the nature of art itself. It asks a question that echoes in that pre-dawn library silence. If a story is remembered by no one, written nowhere, does it cease to exist? And if another hand, in another time, writes that story anew, can a ghost be given breath again? Or is it merely a forgery, a beautiful, perfect lie dressed in the borrowed robes of a master? The trail is cold, the evidence is fragmentary, and the closer one looks, the more the line between what is real and what is imagined begins to blur, until you are no longer sure if you are the seeker or the one being sought. Keep the candle lit. We are going into the dark. The story begins not in the smoky shadow of the Globe Theatre, nor in the hushed corridors of Whitehall Palace, where kings leaned forward to catch a whispered line. It begins in a Spanish prison. In 1597, a man sat in a cell in Seville. He was a former tax collector, a failed playwright, a man who had lost the use of his left hand in battle, and with it his dreams of glory. His name was Miguel de Cervantes, and in the damp and the dark, with the scratch of a quill against paper that was likely bought from the jailer at an inflated price, he was constructing a story so vast, so human, that it would outlive empires. It was a story about a man who read too many romances. Alonso Quijano, a gentleman of modest means, filled his head with tales of chivalry, of knights errant, of fair maidens, of giants and enchanters, until the wall between fiction and reality crumbled. He renamed himself Don Quixote, mounted a broken-down horse named Rocinante, and rode out to right the world's wrongs. He was a fool. He was a saint. He was, in the most profound sense, a man who chose to live inside a story. And in the pages of that story, Cervantes placed a tragedy, a tale within a tale, a story so potent that it would, within a decade, leap from the dusty plains of La Mancha to the raked stage of a London playhouse. It is the story of a man named Cardenio. We meet Cardenio in the heart of the Sierra Morena, a mountain range in southern Spain so rugged and desolate that it seems to exist outside of time. The goats that pick their way along its cliffs are tended by goat herds who live in skins and sleep in caves. The air is thin and sharp. The only sounds are the wind and the distant clatter of stone. And in this wilderness, a gentleman from the city finds a madman. He is dressed in rags that once were fine. His skin is burned by the sun. He moves with the erratic grace of a startled animal, and when he speaks, it is to the rocks, to the trees, to the ghosts that only he can see. This is Cardenio. He has fled to the mountains to die, or to forget, or to rage against the heavens until they crack. The gentleman, whose name is also Quixote's faithful squire Sancho Panza, listens as the madman's story spills out in fragments. It is a story of love and betrayal so sharp it could draw blood. Cardenio had loved a woman named Lucinda with a love that was, in his telling, absolute and pure. But a wealthy duke, a man named Fernando, had intervened. Fernando, Cardenio's friend, had sworn he would help the lovers. Instead, he had stolen Lucinda for himself. On the night of her forced wedding to Fernando, Cardenio, hidden and helpless, heard Lucinda utter her vows in a voice so faint it was barely a breath. And then, as the priest blessed the union, she collapsed. She had fainted, they said, but Cardenio, in his agony, believed she had died. He fled the city, stripped himself of his fine clothes, and plunged into the wilderness, where he now lives on roots and wild herbs, his only companions the memory of her face and the conviction that the world is a lie. The goatherds tell the gentleman that when Cardenio is in his lucid moments, he is gentle and wise. But when the madness takes him, he will attack any traveler who comes near, screaming Lucinda's name until he collapses from exhaustion. They have learned to leave him alone. They have learned to let grief have its way. There is a detail in Cervantes' telling that catches the breath. Cardenio, in his sanity, has carved Lucinda's name into the bark of the trees. He has written poems to her on the beech trunks, verses that the rain will wash away and the wind will fray, but for a moment they are there, a testament, a prayer, a desperate attempt to make the internal external, to fix a feeling to the world before it dissolves entirely. This is the raw material. This is the heart laid bare, a man driven to the edge of reason by love, a woman whose voice is silenced at the moment of her greatest crisis, a villain whose charm masks a profound selfishness. It is a story that does not need kings or gods or armies. It needs only the human heart beating itself to pieces against the bars of circumstance. In 1605, the first part of Don Quixote was published in Madrid. It was a sensation. The story of the lanky knight and his rotund squire was read aloud in taverns, debated in universities, and carried across Europe in the saddlebags of travelers. By 1612, an English translation by Thomas Shelton had appeared in London. It was called The History of the Valorous and Witty Knight-errant Don Quixote of the Mancha. London was hungry for Spanish stories. The city was a hive of traders and diplomats, and the plays of Lope de Vega were the talk of the theatrical underground. Playwrights were ravenous for plots, and here, in this fat, rambling book, was a feast. There was the comedy of the knight and his peasant squire. There were tales of rustic life, and there, buried in the mountains, was the tragedy of Cardenio. Imagine a young playwright, already established, already famous, reading this passage for the first time. Perhaps it was by candlelight, in a room overlooking the Thames. Perhaps he read it aloud to a younger man, a rising star named John Fletcher, whose father had been a bishop and whose instincts ran to the passionate and the strange. The story of Cardenio would have landed in their minds like a stone in still water. The rings spread outward. They would have seen the theatrical possibilities immediately. The wilderness setting, perfect for the bare stage of the globe. The mad scenes, a gift for a talented actor. The raw, unmediated emotion that needed no classical learning to be understood. It was a story that could be felt in the gut. And so the story crossed the water, from a Spanish prison to a London playhouse, from the quill of a forgotten tax collector to the hands of the two most popular dramatists in England. The seed was planted, it would take root, and it would grow into something that the world would soon lose and spend the next 4 centuries trying to find again. The factual anchor of this chapter is the year 1612, when Thomas Shelton's English translation of Don Quixote was published, making the story of Cardenio readily available to the London literary world. The document is unremarkable at first glance. A folio page, bound in a volume of stiff vellum, filled with the cramped, workmanlike hand of a government accountant. The ink has browned with age, and the edges of the page are frayed, as if touched by too many seeking fingers. It is an account book of the treasurer of the king's chamber, a record of money spent on the pleasures of the court. The year is 1613. James I is on the throne, a king who prefers the quiet scholarship of his study to the public spectacle favored by his predecessor, Elizabeth. But a court must have its entertainments. And so, in the cold months of winter, when the Thames sometimes froze solid and the roads were choked with mud, players were summoned from the public playhouses to perform in the warm, candlelit halls of Whitehall Palace. The accountant's entry, dated May 20th, 1613, is brief and specific. It records a payment of £20 to John Heminges, one of the leading actors and business managers of the King's Men, the very company to which William Shakespeare belonged. The payment is for the performance of a play. The accountant, in his haste, scribbled the title as he heard it, Cardenio. £20 was a significant sum, far more than a public performance would earn. It was a mark of royal favor. The play had been deemed worthy of the king's eyes, and the date places it squarely in the final years of Shakespeare's career, a time when he was spending more and more time in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon, but still writing, still collaborating. This single entry is the bedrock of the entire mystery. It is the fossil, the footprint in the ash. It proves, beyond any reasonable doubt, that a play based on the story of Cardenio existed, was performed, and was associated with Shakespeare's company. The void on the shelf begins here, not with an absence, but with a presence, a moment when the play was alive. Let us step into that room, not the vast hall of Whitehall, but a smaller, more intimate space. A writer's chamber, perhaps in the liberty of the Clink, on the bankside, where the playhouses stood, and the smell of the river was always present. The time is late 1612 or early 1613. Two men sit at a table. One is William Shakespeare. He is 48 years old, a successful gentleman with a coat of arms and a large house in Stratford. His best tragedies are behind him, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, but his hand has not lost its cunning. He is experimenting now, moving toward a different kind of drama, one that blends tragedy with romance, that ends not in death, but in reconciliation. Plays like The Winter's Tale and The Tempest are yet to come. The other man is John Fletcher. He is half Shakespeare's age, just entering his 30s. He is the son of a bishop who fell from favor and died in debt, leaving John to make his own way in the world. He has already written successful plays on his own and in collaboration with Francis Beaumont, and his style is distinctive, swifter, more direct, more focused on extravagant emotion and surprising twists. He is the future of the English stage. Between them lies a copy of Shelton's Don Quixote, open to the story of Cardenio. The book is probably well thumbed, with passages marked. They are working together, as was common practice. One might sketch out a scene, handing it to the other for revision. Lines would be crossed out, new ones inserted in the margins. The rhythm of two minds, two voices, weaving a single fabric. What would they have talked about? Perhaps they discussed the challenge of adapting a prose narrative to the stage. Cervantes' story is told in flashbacks, with Cardenio revealing his past to a stranger. How do you make that theatrical? Do you show the courtship of Cardenio and Lucinda directly, letting the audience fall in love with them before the betrayal? Or do you keep the mystery, revealing the past through the fragmented speeches of a madman? And then there is the character of Lucinda. In Cervantes, she is largely silent, a figure of pathos. Shakespeare, who had created Rosalind and Viola and Cleopatra, would surely have wanted to give her a voice, to let her speak her fear, her defiance, her grief. Perhaps they gave her a scene of her own, a moment alone on stage, carving her name into a tree, waiting for a lover who will not come. Fletcher's hand might have been drawn to the character of Fernando, the treacherous duke. Fletcher had a talent for creating charming villains, men whose surface elegance masked a profound moral vacancy. He would have relished the opportunity to write Fernando's seduction of Lucinda, his smooth lies, his casual cruelty. On the evening of the performance, the players would have gathered at Whitehall. They would have carried their costumes and a few simple props through the cold streets, crossing the river by boat to the palace stairs. The great hall would have been transformed, tapestries hung on the walls to keep out the draught, candles blazed in iron chandeliers. The king sat on his raised dais, surrounded by his courtiers, their faces painted islands in a sea of velvet and lace. The play began. We do not know its exact title. The accountant wrote Cardenio, but another record, a diary entry from a young lawyer named Humphrey Moseley, calls it The History of Cardenio. Perhaps the full title was something grander, more evocative, like the titles of the time, The Mad Lover of the Mountains or The Treachery of Friendship. The actors spoke the lines that Shakespeare and Fletcher had written. They brought Cardenio's madness to life, his rages and his sorrows. They showed Lucinda's terror as she was forced toward the altar. They revealed Fernando's villainy in all its selfish glory. The court watched. They applauded. The king, perhaps, nodded his approval. And then the play was over. The candles were snuffed. The players returned to the bankside. The words that had filled the hall for a few hours dissolved into the air, leaving only a memory in the minds of those who had been there. John Heminges, the company's manager, kept a copy of the manuscript. It would have been a prompt book, covered with notes, marked with cues for actors and stagehands. It was a working document, not a literary treasure. It was paper and string. It was valuable only as a means to an end, the next performance. No one thought to preserve it. No one imagined that 400 years later, people would be sifting through old records, desperate for any trace of its existence. It was just a play, one of many. And then it vanished. The factual anchor for this chapter is the extant record in the British Library, the Treasurer of the Chamber's account book for 1613, showing the payment to John Heminges for a play called Cardenio. On the 23rd of April, 1616, William Shakespeare died in Stratford-upon-Avon. He was 52 years old. The story goes that he succumbed to a fever after a night of heavy drinking with his fellow playwrights, Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton. Whether this is true or simply a tale told to soften the hard fact of mortality, we cannot say. What we know is that he was buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church, and above his grave, a stone was laid with a curse. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. His literary legacy, however, was far less secure. Plays were not considered literature in the way poems were. They were ephemeral things, written to be performed and then discarded. The manuscripts were the property of the playing company, not the author. If they survived by accident. 7 years after Shakespeare's death, two of his friends and fellow actors, John Heminges and Henry Condell, undertook a monumental task. They gathered together as many of his plays as they could find, collecting prompt books, actors' parts, and scribbled authors' drafts, and they published them in a single, large volume. It is known to history as the First Folio. The title page bears an engraving of Shakespeare by Martin Droeshout, a stiff, formal portrait that seems to capture a man caught between two worlds, the world of the flesh and the world of the imagination. The book contains 36 plays. Without it, masterpieces like Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and The Tempest would almost certainly have been lost. It is, in the truest sense, a monument. But Cardenio is not there. The absence is conspicuous. Heminges and Condell were meticulous. They included plays that had never been printed before. They included plays that Shakespeare had written in collaboration with others, such as Henry VIII. They knew their friends' work intimately. If a manuscript of Cardenio had existed in their possession or in the company's archives, why would they have left it out? Several possibilities present themselves, each one a ghost story in miniature. Perhaps the manuscript was already lost. In the 7 years since Shakespeare's death, the King's men had continued to perform, to tour, to acquire new plays. Documents could have been mislaid. A trunk could have been left in a cart after a performance in Oxford or Cambridge. A fire in a tiring house could have turned a sheaf of papers to ash. The play might have vanished before the folio was even conceived. Perhaps it was omitted because it was considered too collaborative. By 1623, John Fletcher was the premier playwright of the King's Men, having effectively taken over Shakespeare's role as the company's house dramatist. Including a play co-written with Fletcher might have complicated the folio's purpose, which was to enshrine Shakespeare as a solitary genius, a figure apart. Cardenio might have been seen as belonging as much to the living Fletcher as to the dead Shakespeare. Or perhaps, and this is the most tantalizing possibility, the play was not considered worthy. The story of Cardenio, so powerful in Cervantes, might not have translated well to the stage. The collaboration might have been hasty, the result uneven. Heminges and Condell, in their judgment, might have deemed it inferior, a work that did not deserve a place beside Hamlet or King Lear. Whatever the reason, the void was now formalized. The First Folio defined what Shakespeare was, and by its silence, it defined what he was not. Cardenio was cast into the outer darkness, a play without a home, a story without a text. The hunt, though no one yet knew it, had begun, not for a lost play, but for a ghost. But ghosts have a habit of whispering, and in the years that followed, a faint whisper could be heard in the musty back rooms of London's booksellers. In 1653, 30 years after the folio, a man named Humphrey Moseley, perhaps the same Humphrey Moseley who, as a young lawyer, might have seen Cardenio at court, was registering books for publication with the Stationers' Company. He entered a list of plays, some by Shakespeare, some by Fletcher, some by other authors. Among them, he wrote down a title, The History of Cardenio by Mr. Fletcher and Shakespeare. This entry is the second pillar of the mystery. It confirms what the court payment only suggested, that Cardenio was a collaborative work. It gives us the authors' names, linked in the official record. It proves that a manuscript, or at least a memory of a manuscript, still existed 40 years after the play was first performed, but mostly never published it. He registered many plays that he never printed. Perhaps he couldn't find a clean copy. Perhaps the market for old plays had dried up. Perhaps the manuscript was lost in the chaos of the English Civil War, which had raged for much of the previous decade, destroying libraries and scattering collections. The whisper fades, the door closes, the void remains. For the next 70 years, Cardenio sleeps. It exists only as a rumor, a footnote in bibliographies, a name that scholars occasionally mention before turning back to the safe, solid ground of the folio. But the story is not dead. It is merely waiting for a man with a quill and a hunger for fame, a man who would claim to have found what everyone else had lost. The factual anchor of this chapter is the Stationer's Register entry of 1653, in which Humphrey mostly records the history of Cardenio by Mr. Fletcher and Shakespeare. The world had changed. The Civil War was a memory, the monarchy restored, and the old certainties had crumbled. London was rebuilding, not just its streets after the Great Fire of 1666, but its sense of itself. It was the dawn of the 18th century, an age of coffee houses and clubs, of scientific inquiry and polished verse. Reason was the watchword. Emotion was suspect. The wild passions of the Jacobean stage seemed as distant and barbaric as the medieval morality plays. But the past has a way of asserting itself, and in the early years of the century, a man emerged who would claim to have reached across the divide and brought something back. His name was Lewis Theobald. He was a curious figure caught between two worlds. He was a critic, a man of sharp intelligence who would later become one of Shakespeare's most important editors, correcting errors in the folios with a scholar's precision. But he was also a writer of farces and pantomimes, a grub street hack who knew the value of a popular success. He was ambitious, he was hungry, and he was not above bending the truth. In 1727, Theobald announced a discovery that sent a tremor through the literary world. He claimed to have in his possession several manuscripts of a lost play by Shakespeare, not copies, not transcripts, but original 17th-century manuscripts. The play was called Double Falsehood, or The Distressed Lovers, and Theobald asserted, without hesitation, that it was the long-lost Cardenio. The story Theobald told was carefully constructed. He claimed to have obtained the manuscripts from a man named, he left the name blank, a space for rumor to fill. He said there were 3 of them, in different hands, which allowed him to collate them and produce a definitive text. He implied, without quite stating, that they had come from the library of a noble family, perhaps the Covent Garden collection of a recently deceased bibliophile. The play itself was a curious artifact. It told the story of 2 friends, Julio and Henriquez. Henriquez, the son of a duke, seduces and abandons a girl named Violante. He then falls in love with his friend Julio's betrothed, Leonora, and with the help of her corrupt father, attempts to force her into marriage. Julio, betrayed and enraged, flees to the mountains, where he lives as a hermit, eventually encountering a shepherd who turns out to be the disguised Violante. It was unmistakably a version of the Cardenio story, adapted and anglicized. The play was performed at Drury Lane Theatre in December 1727. The prologue, written by Theobald himself, walked a careful line between humility and assertion. He admitted that the play had been revised and adapted to the taste of a modern audience. He confessed that he had altered some passages to make them more intelligible to the present age. But he insisted that the foundation, the substance, the soul of the play was Shakespeare's. The audience applauded. The critics were divided. Some hailed Theobald as a savior, a man who had restored a lost treasure to the nation. Others, led by the formidable poet Alexander Pope, were deeply suspicious. Pope had a personal grudge against Theobald, who had dared to correct errors in Pope's own edition of Shakespeare, but the suspicion went deeper than personal animosity. It was a suspicion about the very nature of the discovery. Where were the manuscripts? Theobald spoke of them, referenced them in his footnotes, but he never showed them to anyone. He claimed to have returned them to their owner. He claimed the owner wished to remain anonymous. The manuscripts themselves, the only physical proof that the play was what Theobald claimed it to be, were invisible. They existed only in his telling. This is the moment when the mystery of Cardenio deepens and darkens. Before Theobald, the play was a simple loss, a tragedy of history. After Theobald, it becomes a hall of mirrors. We are no longer just asking if the play existed. We are asking if the man who claimed to have found it was telling the truth, or was he a forger, a fabricator, a man who looked into the void and decided to fill it with something of his own making. Theobald published the text of Double Falsehood in 1728. He dedicated it to a nobleman, as was the custom. In his preface, he doubled down on his claims, insisting on the authenticity of his sources. But the shadow remained. The manuscripts were ghosts. The play was a paper ghost, a thing that looked like Shakespeare, sounded like Shakespeare, but might, under scrutiny, prove to be something else entirely. The question was now posed, and it would never go away. It would haunt scholarship for 300 years. It would drive men to obsession, and it would never receive a definitive answer. The factual anchor for this chapter is the year 1727, when Lewis Theobald's Double Falsehood was first performed at Drury Lane Theatre in London. Let us sit with Lewis Theobald in his study. It is late. The candles have burned low and the tallow smokes, casting shifting shadows on the walls. On his desk lies a pile of paper, his own drafts, his revisions, his attempts to make an old story new. And beside them, perhaps, a single sheet of genuine 17th century paper, purchased from a dealer, blank but aged, waiting to be filled. What is a forgery? It is not merely a lie, it is a performance. The forger must become someone else, must think someone else's thoughts, must feel someone else's rhythm in his hand. He must study his subject until the subject's voice becomes his own. He must, in a sense, be possessed. If Theobald was a forger, he was a brilliant one. He had spent years editing Shakespeare. He knew the plays backwards and forwards. He knew the rare words, the favorite phrases, the characteristic pauses. He knew that Shakespeare used mobled only once and incarnadine only once. He knew the tricks of the verse, the way Shakespeare would break a line to create emphasis, the way Fletcher would use a feminine ending, an extra unstressed syllable to soften a speech. He had all the tools, and he had a motive. Alexander Pope had humiliated him in the satire The Dunciad, portraying him as the king of the dunces, a pedant and a fool. To produce a lost Shakespeare play would be the ultimate revenge. It would prove his worth. It would silence his enemies. It would make his name immortal. But the evidence against him is circumstantial. The missing manuscripts, the convenient anonymity of the source, the way the language of double falsehood sometimes feels a little too polished, a little too 18th century in its elegance. There are passages that sound like Shakespeare seen through a glass darkly, the raw energy, the violent juxtapositions of image, the sheer daring of the mature Shakespeare. These are muted, smoothed over, made safe for a polite age. Listen to a line from Double Falsehood. The betrayed Julio, wandering in the mountains, cries out, "O memory, thou foul-eyed goblin, that dost haunt the ruins of blasted hopes." It is a striking image. Foul-eyed goblin. It has a Shakespearean ring, but compare it to a genuine line from Shakespeare's late work. In The Winter's Tale, Leonce, consumed by jealousy, says, "There may be in the cup a spider steeped, and one may drink, depart, and yet partake no venom." The difference is subtle but profound. Shakespeare's image is specific, concrete, drawn from domestic life. A spider in a cup. The terror is in the ordinary. Theobald's image is more generalized, more abstract. A foul-eyed goblin is a creature of folklore, not of the hearth. It is effective, but it lacks the specific gravity of the master. And then there are the Fletcher moments. Passages that feel swifter, more theatrical, more concerned with plot than with character. Passages where the verse loosens, becomes almost conversational. Scholars have long noted that some parts of Double Falsehood feel more like Fletcher than like Shakespeare. If Theobald was working from a lost original, perhaps those are the parts Fletcher wrote. If he was forging, perhaps he was simply a good mimic, able to capture two distinct voices. Theobald took his secret to the grave. He died in 1744, a respected if not universally admired figure. He never produced the manuscripts. He never named his source. He left behind only the play, a text that hovers in a liminal space between authenticity and fraud. The 18th century largely accepted Double Falsehood as genuine, or at least as a plausible adaptation of a genuine original. The 19th century, with its worship of Shakespeare as a solitary god, was more skeptical. The play was dismissed as a clumsy forgery, an embarrassment to be forgotten. It was rarely performed, rarely read. But the question would not die. It festered. It waited. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, with new tools and new approaches, scholars would return to it. They would put the play on the operating table. They would dissect its language, count its words, measure its rhythms. They would try to find, in the data, the answer that Theobald had hidden in the shadows. The factual anchor of this chapter is the death of Lewis Theobald in 1744, with the location of his alleged source manuscripts still unknown. The room is no longer a candlelit study. It is a laboratory. The air is cool and dry, conditioned to preserve the books that line the walls. On a screen, lines of text scroll past, each word highlighted in a different color, each sentence parsed by an algorithm that never sleeps. The scholar sits before the machine, not with a quill, but with a keyboard. The tools have changed. The questions remain the same. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a new discipline emerged. It is called computational stylistics or stylometry. It is the science of measuring style. It operates on a simple premise. Every writer has a linguistic fingerprint, a set of habits so ingrained, so unconscious, that they cannot be imitated. The words a writer uses most frequently, the way a writer arranges those words. The little function words, the and the s, and with s, that a writer scatters through a text without thinking. These habits are as unique as a signature, and unlike a signature, they cannot be forged. A forger can imitate a striking phrase, a memorable image, but no forger can control the frequency with which he uses the word upon versus on. No forger can consciously adjust the average length of his sentences to match another's. These are the tics of the brain, the unconscious rhythms of thought. The scholars who study Cardenio have turned to these tools. They have taken the text of Double Falsehood and fed it into the machine. They have compared it to vast databases of Renaissance drama, to every known play of Shakespeare and Fletcher and their contemporaries, and the machine has begun to speak. The results are not simple. They are not a yes or a no. They are a spectrum, a probability, a series of overlapping shadows. Some studies have found that certain scenes in Double Falsehood show a strong statistical resemblance to Shakespeare's late style. The function words cluster in patterns that match the Winter's Tale and the Tempest. The rare words appear with a frequency that is characteristic of the master. In these passages, the ghost seems to flicker into view. Other scenes show a clear affinity with Fletcher. The verse rhythms, the use of colloquialisms, the particular function word preferences all point to the younger playwright. These passages feel different. They move faster. They are more concerned with action than with introspection. And then there are scenes that resemble neither. Scenes that seem to belong to the 18th century. Scenes where the language is too regular, too balanced, too polite to be anything but Theobald's own work. In these passages, the forger, if he was a forger, has laid down his mask. The picture that emerges is strange and complex. It suggests that Theobald was telling the truth up to a point. It suggests that he did have access to some older material, some manuscript that contained fragments of the original Cardenio. Perhaps it was a prompt book, damaged and incomplete. Perhaps it was a transcript made by a theatergoer, a collection of favorite speeches. Theobald took these fragments and wove them into a new play, filling the gaps with his own writing, smoothing the rough edges, making the whole thing presentable to an 18th century audience. The metaphor is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written on, scraped clean, and written on again. Beneath the surface text of Double Falsehood, the faint traces of an older hand can be detected. Not a complete play, not a coherent text, but traces, echoes, words that seem to have survived against all odds. If this is true, then Cardenio is not entirely lost. It exists in fragments, embedded in a later work like fossils in rock. The job of the scholar is not to find a complete manuscript. That hope is almost certainly vain, but to extract the fragments, to isolate the Shakespearean and Fletcherian passages from Theobald's 18th century glue. It is a delicate task. It requires a kind of archaeological patience, but it has been attempted. In 2010, a team of scholars and writers, including the playwright Stephen Greenblatt, attempted a reconstruction. They took the stylometric data, they identified the passages most likely to be authentic, and they wrote new scenes to bridge the gaps, imagining what the original play might have looked like. The result was a new Cardenio, a modern play based on an old ghost. But is it the play? Can a reconstruction ever be more than an approximation? The question returns, as it always does, to the nature of authenticity. If the words are not Shakespeare, But the story is, and the structure is, and the intention is, does it matter who held the quill? The factual anchor for this chapter is the publication of The Search for a Lost Shakespeare Play, Cardenio by Breen Hammond in 2010, a landmark study that used stylometric analysis to argue for the presence of genuine Shakespearean and Fletcherian material in Double Falsehood. While scholars argued in libraries, another kind of hunt was taking place. It was a hunt not for knowledge, but for possession. The void on the shelf was not just an intellectual puzzle, it was a vacuum that drew wealth and desire. In the 19th century, the great age of book collecting, a single leaf of a Shakespeare play would have been worth a fortune. A complete manuscript would have been beyond price. And so, men with money and obsession scoured the attics of England, hoping to be the one to find it. They looked in the great houses, where old papers were sometimes stuffed into trunks and forgotten. They looked in the shops of bookbinders, who often used old manuscript pages as wrapping paper or as stiffening for new bindings. They looked in the stalls of market towns, where a bundle of old documents might be bought for a few pence. There were rumours, always rumours. A farmer in Warwickshire had used old play scripts to line his pigsty. A vicar in Oxfordshire had found a bundle of papers behind a panel in his study and burned them, not knowing what they were. A bookseller in London claimed to have seen a quarto of Cardenio in a private collection, but the collector denied it, and the trail went cold. The most famous of these rumours attached itself to the great Shakespearean actor David Garrick. In the 18th century, Garrick had amassed a vast collection of Shakespearean, including many early editions and documents. After his death, his collection was dispersed. Some items went to the British Museum, others vanished into private hands. For decades, scholars whispered that a manuscript of Cardenio might have been among Garrick's papers, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. The void did not only attract honest seekers, it also attracted those who saw an opportunity. If the world wanted a lost Shakespeare play, the world could be given one. The history of Shakespeare forgery is a long and fascinating one, filled with characters as vivid as any in the plays themselves. The most famous of these was William Henry Ireland. In the 1790s, this young man, the son of a respectable antiquarian, began producing Shakespearean documents. He forged letters, receipts, and even a complete play, Vortigern and Rowena, which he claimed to have discovered in the archives of a noble family. His father, desperate to believe, welcomed the discoveries with open arms. The literary world was divided. Some hailed the young Ireland as a genius, others smelled fraud. Vortigern was actually performed at Drury Lane in 1796. It was a disaster. The audience, sensing the deception, laughed and jeered. The play was never performed again. Ireland eventually confessed, admitting that he had forged the entire thing. His motive? He wanted to please his father. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted, like Theobald before him, to fill a void. But Cardenio escaped the forger's attention, perhaps because it was too obscure, perhaps because Theobald's version had already filled the space, making a new forgery unnecessary. The play remained a ghost, not a target. There is one rumor that persists. It is the kind of rumor that circulates among rare book dealers and academic librarians, passed along in hushed voices at conferences. It is the rumor of the unseen library. Somewhere the story goes, there is a private collection. It is not open to scholars. It is not listed in any catalogue. It is the accumulation of generations of a single family who have bought wisely and quietly, never drawing attention to themselves. In this library, among the incunabula and the illuminated manuscripts, there is a small, unassuming volume, a quarto, bound in plain calfskin. The title page is missing, but the text inside is unlike anything in the folio. It is Cardenio. The rumor surfaces every few decades. A dealer will hint that he has seen it. A scholar will receive a letter, anonymous, suggesting that the play exists, but no proof is ever offered. The library remains unseen. The volume remains a fantasy. Is it true? Almost certainly not. The hope is a cruel one, a mirage that keeps the hunt alive, but it is also a testament to the power of the void. The empty space on the shelf is not just an absence, it is a possibility. And as long as it remains empty, anything is possible. The play could be anywhere. It could be lining a trunk in an attic. It could be wrapped around a parcel in a junk shop. It could be waiting, as it has always waited, for the right pair of eyes to find it. The factual anchor for this chapter is the exposure of the Ireland forgeries in 1796, a cautionary tale of how the desire for a lost Shakespeare can lead to deception. We have spoken much of Shakespeare, we have let his name fill the silence, but Cardenio was not his alone. It belonged also to another man, a man whose ghost has been waiting in the wings, patient and overlooked. It is time to call him forward. John Fletcher was born in 1579, the son of a clergyman who rose to become Bishop of London and then fell from grace, accused of financial misconduct and dying in debt. The young Fletcher was left to make his own way. He went to Cambridge, as Shakespeare did not, and emerged with a classical education and a hunger for the stage. By the early 1600s, he had found his voice. He wrote plays of extravagant emotion, of sudden twists and surprising revelations. His heroes are often driven by obsession. His heroines are often caught in impossible situations. He had a genius for theatrical effect, for moments that make an audience gasp. And he had a gift for collaboration. With Francis Beaumont, he wrote a string of hits, including Philaster and The Maid's Tragedy. When Beaumont retired, Fletcher became the primary dramatist for The King's Men, the position Shakespeare had once held. He was, in a sense, Shakespeare's successor. When the two men sat down to write Cardenio, they would have divided the labor. This was standard practice. One playwright might sketch out the plot, another might write the first act, a third might revise the whole. In the case of Shakespeare and Fletcher, scholars have identified distinct patterns in their collaborative plays, such as Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen. Shakespeare's hand is characterized by density. His lines are packed with meaning, with metaphor, with the pressure of thought. He tends to slow down time, to linger on moments of crisis. His verse is flexible, shifting from formal to colloquial in a single line. Fletcher's hand is swifter. His verse has a distinctive rhythm, often using an extra unstressed syllable at the end of a line. This is called a feminine ending, and it gives his lines a lighter, more conversational feel. He is more interested in plot than in psychology. His characters are vivid, but they often lack the interior depth of Shakespeare. In Cardenio, the madness of the protagonist would have been a gift for both writers. Shakespeare could explore the inner experience of grief, the way it fragments thought and memory. Fletcher could stage the outward manifestations of madness, the rages and the sudden silences, the moments of shocking violence. Together, they could create a portrait of a broken mind that was both inward and outward, both psychological and theatrical. Imagine a scene from their lost play. Cardenio, alone in the mountains, encounters a shepherd, but the shepherd is not a shepherd. It is Lucinda, disguised, searching for him. In Cervantes, this recognition is delayed, complicated. In the play, it would have been a moment of high drama. Would Shakespeare have written the recognition scene with its complex emotions, its mingling of joy and despair? Would Fletcher have written the scenes of disguise and intrigue that led up to it? We cannot know, but we can guess. And in our guessing, we reconstruct not the play itself, but the shape of the collaboration, the dance of two minds around a single story. Fletcher died in 1625, 9 years after Shakespeare. He was buried in St. Saviour's Church, Southwark, near the Bankside Playhouses. His grave is less famous than Shakespeare, but it is there. And in the church, among the monuments to actors and playwrights, there is a silence that matches the silence in Stratford. A silence for all the words that were written and lost. The factual anchor for this chapter is the death of John Fletcher in 1625 and his burial in what is now Southwark Cathedral, where his monument can still be seen. The theatre is dark, the benches are empty, the stage is a bare platform of oak, worn smooth by the feet of countless players, but in the mind we can light the candles, we can summon the audience, we can attempt the impossible, a performance of Cardenio. We have the source material from Cervantes, we have the structure of Theobald's Double Falsehood, we have the stylometric data that suggests which passages might be authentic, we have the known conventions of the Jacobean stage. With these fragments, we can build a ghost. The play would have begun, as most plays did, with a flourish of trumpets. The prologue would have stepped forward, perhaps in a scholar's gown, to ask for the audience's patience. He might have mentioned the Spanish source, the exotic setting, the tragic story to come. Then he would have withdrawn, and the play would begin. The setting is the city, perhaps Seville, perhaps a fictional court. We see Cardenio and Lucinda, young and in love. Their dialogue is full of the heightened language of romance. They speak of vows, of constancy, of a future that seems assured. This is the calm before the storm, the happiness that makes the coming tragedy bearable. Enter Fernando. He is Cardenio's friend, but his eyes linger too long on Lucinda. He speaks smoothly, charmingly. The audience, familiar with the conventions of tragicomedy, senses the danger. They know that this charm conceals a predator. The scenes shift. We see the seduction, the betrayal. We see Lucinda forced toward the altar, her protests ignored. We see Cardenio, hidden, listening as his beloved speaks her vows in a voice drained of life. And then, the collapse, the fainting, the assumption of death. The scene changes. The city is gone. We are in the Sierra Morena, the wild mountains where the laws of civilization do not apply. The stage is bare, but the language paints the rocks and the trees. Cardenio enters, his clothes torn, his hair wild. He speaks to the air, to the memory of Lucinda, to the gods who have abandoned him. This is the heart of the play, the mad scenes. The actor would have had a chance to display his full range, moving from raging despair to gentle lucidity in a single breath. He would have carved Lucinda's name into the stage post, a gesture that the audience would have seen as both pathetic and profound. And then the recognition. The disguised Lucinda appears. The two lovers, both broken by circumstance, circle each other in a dance of mistaken identity. The moment of revelation, when shepherd becomes woman, when stranger becomes beloved, would have been the climax. The audience would have wept. The ending, in the tradition of tragicomedy, would have been reconciliatory. Fernando, perhaps, would have repented. The fathers would have blessed the unions. The lovers would have been reunited. But the joy would have been shadowed by the memory of suffering. The play would have ended not with uncomplicated happiness, but with a quiet awareness of what had been lost and regained. The candles gutter, the applause fades, the play is over, and we are left in the dark theater of the mind with only the echo of words that may never have been spoken in a performance that never took place. The factual anchor for this chapter is the known structure of Jacobean tragicomedy, a genre pioneered by Fletcher and employed in many of his collaborations, which typically moved from apparent tragedy to a final, sometimes uneasy, reconciliation. We return to the library. It is dawn again. The same pale light filters through the high windows, illuminating the same dust motes drifting in the same silent air. We stand before the shelf. The empty space is still there. Nothing has changed. The manuscripts have not been found. Theobald's secrets remain buried with him. The fragments detected by the stylometric algorithms remain fragments, tantalizing but incomplete. The void endures. But something has changed in us. We have spent hours in the company of a ghost. We have traced its origins in a Spanish prison, followed its journey to a London stage, watched it flicker in the records of a court accountant, and seen it assume a dubious shape in the hands of an 18th-century scholar. We have learned that absence can be as powerful as presence, that a story can survive its own destruction. The mystery of Cardenio is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a condition to be inhabited. It is a reminder that the past is not a stable place, not a collection of facts to be mastered, but a shifting landscape of memory and loss. We can never fully recover what has been lost. We can only circle around the absence, telling stories about the stories that are gone. The question that began this journey, if a story is remembered by no one, does it cease to exist, has no simple answer. Cardenio is remembered. It is remembered in the court records and the stationer's register. It is remembered in the pages of Double Falsehood. It is remembered in the efforts of scholars and the dreams of readers. It exists even without a text. It exists as a possibility, a potential, a name that carries the weight of a lost world. But is that enough? Is a story that exists only as a rumor, only as a set of fragments embedded in a later work, still a story? Or is it something else, a memory of a story, a ghost that haunts the edges of literature? The play itself, if it could speak, might answer with the words that Cervantes gave to Cardenio, carved into the bark of a tree, a plea against oblivion. Here lies a lover's grief, inscribed by love. The grief remains, the love remains. The inscription, the physical text, is gone, but the grief and the love are still real. They still have power. They still move us across centuries, across languages, across the divide between the living and the dead. The library is growing lighter. The dawn has become morning. The dust motes dance in the strengthening sun, and the empty space on the shelf seems less like a void and more like a threshold. It is a space that invites the imagination to enter. It is a space that asks us to complete what time has left unfinished. We will never hold Cardenio in our hands. We will never read its lines in the original ink, never see its stage directions in the hand of an Elizabethan scribe. That hope is a fantasy, a dream that sustains the hunt but will never be realized. The play is ash. The paper is dust. But the story is not ash. The story is not dust. The story lives wherever it is told. It lives in the mind of the reader who imagines those lost scenes. It lives in the theater of the imagination, where the candles are always lit and the actors never tire. It lives in the space between what was and what might have been. And so we leave the library. We leave the shelf empty. We leave the mystery unsolved, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be kept. They are meant to remind us that the world is larger than our knowledge, that the past is deeper than our records, and that the greatest stories are sometimes the ones that were never written down. Keep the candle lit. The story is not over, it is only waiting. The factual anchor for this final chapter is the ongoing status of the Cardenio mystery in contemporary scholarship, with no original manuscript having ever been found, and the authenticity of double falsehood remaining a subject of debate.